Ray.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for organizing this and hosting this. I'm very appreciative. And thanks to Sasha also for participating. I'm very grateful. I'm just going to take a little bit of time to give an overview of the book. I want to talk a little bit about its contents, a little bit about the aims I had in writing the book and some of the conclusions. And I thought I might back into the book in some ways and start from the end of it to the earlier portion of the book. But I also just want to clarify, and I think from the introduction, there's probably a good sense of what I'm talking about when I talk about libertarian exit, but I just want to make sure I stress what I mean by this. And I'll start with libertarian. I'm a historian of Latin America, not so much the US, so this was a little bit of a divergence or digression for me. But in most of the world, libertario or libertarian is more or less synonymous with anarchist, so both anti-authoritarian, but also anti-capitalist. But here I'm talking about libertarians in the sort of US and increasingly, if you've been following the elections in the United Kingdom, the UK sense of the word as well. So I'm talking about individuals who understand themselves as libertarian with a sense of being hyper-capitalist. They are radically individualist. They understand freedom largely as something defined by the marketplace and defined through property rights. So property is kind of foundational as a kind of operating concept related to freedom. They are advocates of the minimalist or ultra-minimalist state. And what I mean by that is not that the state is necessarily smaller, but that the state is limited in the range of its functions. And so the state should only exist for national defense, so military, to protect its investors or supporters from violence, so a police force, to protect property rights. So again, a police force, but also a judiciary in terms of things like fraud, breach of contract, and the like, and then patent offices and stuff like that. So the minimalist state is a state that is limited by the range of its functions, not by its size. You can imagine a military and a police force and a judiciary that's a pretty expensive state. And lastly, they're inspired by some of the classic libertarian and neoliberal thinkers of the 20th century, mostly Anglophone world. Certainly people like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek figure in their sort of range of intellectual genealogy, as well as Robert Nozick, who wrote Anarchy, State, and Utopia in 1974. But the core people that they gravitate to are Ayn Rand and Ludwig von Mises. Rand sort of explicitly rejected the term libertarian for herself, but I include her in a kind of broad umbrella of what I would call libertarian thinkers. So that's essentially what I mean by libertarian. What I mean by exit is the desire on the part of these individuals to leave the existing nation states that they belong to, and in some sense, the existing nation state system, and create a kind of new sovereign country or territory. They, in theory, again, they don't want to be expats. They don't want to just leave and set up shop someplace else, but still have sort of tax obligations and citizenship obligations and potentially draft obligations and so on and so forth elsewhere. They actually want to leave and set up an entirely new entity. Ideally, that entity would be structured according to their kind of libertarian ideals. It would be largely a country driven through market relations, transactional relations, contractual relations. It would be minimalist in terms of the state functions. And just about everything would be in some form or another structured through private kinds of governing services. And in fact, that's the term that they frequently use today to talk about their aspirational state, which is that it's a governing services enterprise rather than a state per se. And that gives you a sense of sort of where they're coming from. Before I talk more about the contents of the book, I just wanted to say a couple of things about why one might care about this stuff. One is because it's around us now in many different forms. Certainly what gathers the most attention in the media and elsewhere are things like Bezos's space rocket, Elon Musk's desires to colonize Mars, aspirations to translate one's consciousness into digital code, into computer code, and achieve a certain kind of infinite life and so forth. But my suggestion with the book is that these kinds of hyper digital projects are distractions. They're largely vanity projects. To keep one person alive in space takes an enormous effort of hundreds of people on the ground just for 5 days or something. So these are really sort of vanity projects, and they're quite distracting. I think we need to pay attention to these much more mundane and what you could call analog projects, classic territorial projects, colonization schemes, forms of primitive accumulation, if you would like. Things like seasteading. So I have 2 chapters at the end of the book where I take up the most current projects. Seasteading is one. This was the Seasteading Institute was founded in 2008. It was founded with a $500,000 sort of unicorn. I don't know if it counts as a unicorn or something else. I know they have different terms for these things. But a big investment by Peter Thiel, a kind of Silicon Valley iconoclast, self-professed libertarian, but also a backer of Donald Trump and someone who's the founder and owner of Palantir, which is probably the largest surveillance agency that is used by the US government in the country. Seasteading, the idea behind seasteading was essentially to create Burning Man on the high seas. This was the sort of way it was marketed. But the idea was to have these sort of truly sort of sovereign, free-floating platforms on the high seas, whatever the high seas might be. This was one of the issues that the Seasteading Institute ran into, which is it's not entirely clear legally what constitutes the high seas and what you can do on them. They ran into other problems too, labor costs. If you want to be far, far away from land, where you can have these kinds of floating sovereign platforms, labor costs are going to be quite extraordinary. Engineering costs, engineering designs were problematic as well. You can't have a fixed platform because the ocean is too deep in these locations for you to actually have the platform fixed. So it has to float, but then you have to think about how you deal with questions of ballast and floating. And so classic engineering kinds of issues as well. They moved closer to shore in 2017 to Tahiti. They had a memorandum of understanding with the government of Tahiti. The government of Tahiti, by the way, is autonomous, but still governed by the French. It's part of French Polynesia. And that's important because one of the threads in the story that I tell in the book from the 1950s to the present is the constant attractiveness of places that have a certain kind of in-between political status or are in the process of decolonizing. Those places become quite attractive to the libertarian exiters as places where they think they can, in fact, assert their will in certain kinds of ways and negotiate sweetheart deals for themselves in some sense. The seasteaders continue. The memorandum of understanding with Tahiti fell apart, but they continue to do their thing. They continue to try to raise money. They did what most kind of digital libertarian outfits do when they run into trouble, which is they issued a cryptocurrency called Varion. That didn't do very well, but in the meantime, they are engaging in certain kinds of activities off the coast of Panama and continue to raise money and support, and they have a newsletter, and you can follow them. The other project that's a contemporary project that I look at is Free Private Cities. These used to be, or these are kind of a derivation of what's called charter cities. These are mostly, they're unfolding in a number of different places, but in particular in Honduras today, in Central America. These were efforts to attempt to create private gated communities. Initially, the idea with charter cities was open cities, opt-in cities. You could opt in or you could opt out. And with minimal sort of migratory regulations. Of course, there would have had to have been migratory regulations, which complicates the whole idea of opt-in and opt-out. But it started as a kind of idea about charter cities, and these would be cities that the idealized version of this would be Hong Kong, a kind of special economic zone in which there were no labor rights and the like, but it would be built on territory ceded by the Honduran government to a group of either international investors or a kind of overarching international board made up of investor nation states. But the real fundamental premise here that I want to stress is that this would be territory over the sovereignty of which Honduras would cede control. In other words, it would give away a portion of its territory for a long period of time. And these territories would then have their own judiciaries, their own labor laws, their own military, police forces, and so on and so forth. Anybody living there would live there under contract and would not have any kind of voting rights. And so there's a whole array, of course, of things that come in the wake of that. Charter cities morphed into something a little more libertarian, hyper-capitalist, if you like, which is free private cities. Same premise, but instead of opt-in, opt-out, it's buy-in. So you would need to invest and have the money to invest and buy into these enterprises. They would be gated. There would be limits on who could come in and who could come out, and so on and so forth. What happens to these projects is unclear at this point in Honduras, but there is at least one of these projects that's ongoing. It may end up just becoming a sort of timeshare community. At this point, it's not clear that it's going to have sort of sovereignty over the land that it has, but this is on the island of Roatan off the coast of Honduras in the Bay Islands. And you can look up this project. It's called Roatan Prospera. And that's an ongoing project. And I'll just add one last thing. I don't talk about this in the book, but I'll just mention in passing for those of you who are following what's been unfolding in England, not the death of the Queen, but the end of Boris Johnson's rule and his replacement by an even more hyper-libertarian group of Tories, Liz Truss and the people around her. These are people who are sort of have been sort of raised on the kinds of ideological perspectives that I'm talking about, including Jacob Reed-Moss, I'm trying to remember his exact name. It's Rees-Mogg, I think is his last name, Jacob Rees-Mogg. His father wrote a book called The Sovereign Individual in 1997 that's been very, very influential amongst Silicon Valley libertarian sort of tech types. And the premise being that the state is a sort of protection racket scheme, and it's connected to a lot of thinking that goes by the name of sort of neo-reactionary thought or feudalism, neo-feudalism. And it's a sort of world of basically anti-democratic politics at its most basic. So this is a new epoch in some sense of kind of neoliberal privatization. It's the kind of, taking neoliberalism to its radical but logical extreme. It's also a form of climate change prepping at some level, essentially finding ways to build a kind of stopgap measure on the planet that essentially protects the wealthiest, right, from the worst things coming from climate change catastrophe, while the rest of us sort of have to dig it out. The ultimate upshot in many respects is that it's a form of class warfare. And, Mike Davis, the great historian and urban theorist, he's very ill and passing away. And, I wanted to honor him by just recalling, the very important statement that he makes in one of his works, which is that, for Earth's first-class passengers, as he puts it, the important thing is to find a way to ensure that they do not have a privileged exit option. Right? This is not so much about the question of exit, it's about the question of having a privileged exit option, because ultimately this is kind of primitive accumulation and class warfare by other means. Now, having said this, the interesting thing, of course, about the Silicon Valley tech-utopians and also their allies in the government who used to work in Ronald Reagan's administration, many of Ronald Reagan's Central American affairs folks are involved in some of these projects in Honduras. I don't want to give you the impression that this is when it all started, is with Silicon Valley. This is certainly the story they like to tell about themselves, that they're sort of sui generis, Steve Jobs in their garage creating the computer and this kind of stuff, which of course is not the case. And Kropotkin has a wonderful statement about no one can say this is just mine. Everything was created by the minds of generations of artisans and workers and laborers and others. And there's no exception here either. So I wanted to go back in time and not spend solely my attention on the kind of contemporary movement. And so I spent a lot of time in the book, in the first half of the book, the first 2/3 of the book, looking at projects in the 1960s and the 1970s. And it's quite interesting because there's a very similar kind of feel to the moment in time. The 1960s, as much as it's remembered as a sort of moment of the new left and the emergence of social movements of various kinds, it was also the eruption of libertarian thinking and practice in the United States as well. Barry Goldwater ran for president in the early 1960s. You have the creation of the sort of Young Americans for Freedom, Bill Buckley's organization that sort of mobilized young conservatives at Yale and elsewhere. You have an incredible libertarian movement develop in Southern California, not just in Orange County, but in Los Angeles as well. Huge kind of zine culture that was sort of libertarian zine culture. You have multiple experiments in trying to create new countries of various kinds on the open ocean, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere. So much so that you could also, you could sort of call this not so much the age of Aquarius, but the age of Atlantis. Atlantis was the kind of touchstone term for libertarians. They were constantly creating Atlantis or a new Atlantis or new Atlantis. If you watch Futurama, you'll get the joke. So, this is this kind of moment. And of course, it is a moment also that parallels our own in certain interesting ways. Ecological crisis. This is the era of Garrett Hardin's, very conservative and problematic understanding of the commons. He wrote The Tragedy of the Commons in 1968. That same year, Paul and Ann Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, which was this sort of, catastrophic story of approaching demographic collapse, overpopulation, famine, and the like. Frank Herbert wrote Dune, with various sort of apocalyptic scenario of the future. Harry Harrison wrote a book called Make Room, that was the sort of title tells you it all, which was turned into a film called Soylent Green with Charlton Heston, in which the population in the year 2022, very nice resonance there, the population is reduced to eating little capsules of what they think is plankton because of the ways in which overpopulation and ecological destruction has destroyed the planet's food sources. But Charlton Heston finds out that, in fact, these are capsules made up of corpses of people. Right? So there's this very sort of apocalyptic, dystopic vision in the 1960s. There's also a very apocalyptic vision of monetary collapse. And so this is an era in which libertarians radically begin to embrace metals, classic libertarian strategy, gold and silver rather than paper money, because there's a huge fear that the way in which money, the money supply is controlled by a kind of central federal bank is going to lead to the collapse of the money supply. And they get a lot of this from Ayn Rand and from von Mises and others. And so it's not surprising that someone like James Bond fights a man named Auric Goldfinger, Auric being sort of gold in the sort of Latin in the periodical table, and Goldfinger being Goldfinger, which is a story all about the irradiating of gold and the collapsing of the UK economy because of the way in which the dollar is pegged to gold in the 1960s. That wouldn't last long. Nixon would eventually sort of depeg gold, and gold would rise in value substantially by the early 1970s. The effect of that, by the way, was that people who did invest in gold in the 1960s, many of these libertarians, much like Bitcoin bros today, found themselves very wealthy by 1968, 1969, and 1970, in the same way that Bitcoin bros who invested in Bitcoin in 2011, 2012, 2013, by 2017 found themselves outrageously wealthy. And for those of you who have watched the HBO show, which is misnamed The Anarchists, about the Anarchapulco conference. A lot of the individuals in that documentary, you'll know, became incredibly wealthy and were able to buy these luxurious places for themselves in Acapulco because of the Bitcoin profits, the windfall profits from Bitcoin that they made. One of the individuals in the 1960s who makes a lot of money off of gold and is also a land developer is someone that I track quite closely in the book, and I'm just going to mention him briefly in his 3 projects, and then I'm going to stop. And he's a man by the name of Michael Oliver. Michael Oliver was Jewish from Lithuania. He was the only member of his family to survive the Holocaust. Came to the United States in the 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s, and became quite concerned, understandably so, about totalitarianism. And in the 1960s, everywhere he looked, he seemed to see a kind of approaching totalitarianism. And especially he saw this in urban insurgencies, which he called riots. He saw this in what he called stormtrooper tactics of people that he said were demanding liberty now. Right? So he had a very particular, he wasn't talking about the KKK and the John Birchers, right? He was talking about social movements. So he wrote a book called A New Constitution for a New Country in 1968 and laid out plans to essentially found a new country somewhere outside of the United States. And he did a lot of investigating and a lot of research, and he tried out various places. And there was a lot of people around him, very wealthy individuals. I won't talk about them at this point, but there were a lot of wealthy individuals who invested in his plans. And he had 3 projects over the course of the 1970s that I talk about in great detail. And I want to explain that I talk about them in great detail in the book because I pay very close attention to what is happening in the 3 places where Michael Oliver tries out his projects. And I do this because if you look up Michael Oliver, if you Google him, or if you Google the Ocean Life Research Foundation or the Phoenix Foundation, these are foundations that he helped organize, you'll see that there's a lot of discussion of Michael Oliver of various kinds, some of it serious and some of it sort of, snarky and thinking that these are kind of funny things. But there's very little attention paid to the places where he actually tried these projects out. And my point is that these projects had pretty intense effects on the populations where they were tried out. The first place they were tried out was in the Southwest Pacific. There were 2 reefs in between New Zealand and the archipelagic nation of Tonga. And the effort here was to dredge sand, pile it on the reef, and build eventually a city that would house up to 30,000 people. This didn't go well, and I go into detail about why it didn't go well in the book, but part of the reason it didn't go well is because archipelagic nations in the Pacific Southwest, places like Tonga, Fiji, Nauru, and others, didn't look kindly upon distant colonizers coming and dredging the lagoon and dumping it on top of reefs and trying to build cities. There are lots of reefs and lots of seamounts in the Pacific Southwest, and many of these places were places where those archipelagic populations had connections in certain form. They had seasonal fishing value, lobstering. There were shipwreck sites where relatives had been buried on the reefs and so forth. And so whether or not these reefs belonged territorially or politically or juridically to these countries, these were spaces that were part of their broader cultural and political and social horizons. So that didn't go well. He then had a second project in the Bahamas, in the Caribbean, where along with a pretty eclectic and somewhat disturbing group of individuals, many of them former CIA officers, some of them involved in weapons manufacturing and weapons sales and distribution, in the creation of silencers for some of the deadliest handguns that were being created at the time, such as the Ingram MAC-10. Here, this group of individuals with Michael Oliver attempted to support and back a secessionist movement on 2 of the islands in the Bahamas archipelagic area. This was a secessionist movement that was fueled by British patriotism to some degree, a desire to remain part of the United Kingdom and not become part of the independent Bahamas. But it was also fueled by anti-communism, a fear of red internationalism, as they put it, and also a fear of coming under the control of a predominantly Black government. And so a fear of Black nationalism as well. And there's a strong racist undertone to aspects of this project and some of the secessionist movement. This project also fell apart in part because the individuals that Oliver had allied himself with, and Oliver himself, were coming under investigation from the FBI. And I did a lot of work in FBI files that I got through Freedom of Information Act to kind of track the internal dynamics of what was happening. And then the last project I'll mention in passing very quickly, probably the most detailed chapter in the book, is in the New Hebrides, which is now the country of Vanuatu, also in the Pacific Southwest. And here from 1975 to 1980, Michael Oliver and a group of other individuals, John Hospers, who was a philosophy professor at University of Southern California and a close ally of Ayn Rand's, Nathaniel Brandon, who was Ayn Rand's lover, amongst others, attempted to, again, insinuate themselves into the process of decolonization in the New Hebrides and help foment a secessionist rebellion in the northern islands there. This resulted actually in an uprising in 1980, the Santo Rebellion, which led to death. It led to displacement of a couple of thousand of native Vanuatu people, and complicated the process of independence in the first few months of independence in 1980. At that point, Oliver sort of stopped. He did return to Vanuatu in the 1990s, and I can talk about that in the Q&A if people have questions about sort of what happened in the aftermath. But many of these projects kind of end up coming to an end, not just Oliver's, but others in the 1980s. And the reason that I suggest that this is the case is because you didn't need to territorially secede with the Reagan and Thatcher counter-revolutions of the 1980s, that you could actually socially secede. A process that was already underway in the 1970s in many respects. You could withdraw into gated communities, and there were multiple ways in which you could see your tax burden reduced, and already the state was expanding in terms of military, but it was sort of closing itself down in some ways in terms of all of the sort of social components of the state. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've talked for about a good 25 minutes, and hopefully that gives you a sense of the book, and then Sasha and I can talk, and I'm happy to answer questions. And thank you for listening.
You're right. So you were talking about different periods of time where these impulses to have some kind of exit from the purported constraints of the state were strong, and how they kind of waxed and waned, how you saw an emergence of these, especially in the 1970s, they waned in the 1980s. And then, of course, as you've already noted, we're seeing them again. And I guess I wanted to ask you why you think that is. Obviously, there's a lot of, these are anxious times, and even the ruling class is anxious, and climate is one part of that. But you could also say, like in the 1980s, that the state was delivering so much of what these people actually wanted, in many ways, even more so now. Yeah. Why do you need libertarian exit now? Why do people desire it now when neoliberal capitalism is so elaborated?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a good one. So, I posit a couple of things in the book. So I want to make sure, I don't want to reduce it to a kind of Ponzi scheme or a form of grift, but I also don't want to reject that. I do think part of this is clearly that there's money to be made in these kinds of aspirational projects, and they're a kind of, it's a form of venture capitalism. You raise money. There's a lot of people with a lot of money to kind of put into these kinds of projects, and certainly in a place like Central America and Guatemala and Honduras, there's a very active reception of these. So Patry Friedman, Milton Friedman's grandson, who was the initial director of the Seasteading Institute, he directed the Seasteading Institute. He gave lots of talks in Guatemala at the Francisco Marroquin University, which is a kind of private, free market fundamentalist institution. It's got an auditorium named after Ayn Rand. It's got an auditorium named after Milton Friedman, and so forth. And he gave a lot of talks there. And then after a while, he founded the Free Cities Incorporated. I think that's the name. Which had a similar, it was coming on shore, but having a similar kind of project. All of these were sort of, venture capitalist schemes to get investors and test things out and so forth. So part of this is, I think, it's a business model. It's a place where there's a sort of economy booming in some sense. But there's more to it than that in many instances. There's an ideological component to this that I think is very important. It's a kind of very dangerous combination of ignorance and arrogance and ego. And one of the points I try to make in the book is that, someone like Michael Oliver in the 1960s, I may not agree with the projects. I think I can understand where he's coming from because of his experience and because of the way he, feared a totalitarian turn in mass politics and demagoguery. And, I think he looked in the wrong places for those things, but I can certainly understand where he might be coming from. The contemporary projects are a little different. They draw from Rand, as did Oliver, but they draw from a much more what I call Nietzschean side of Rand. And what I mean by that is there's a real sense, I think, of being able to bend reality to your will. And it's not unusual in many of these projects to see that part of the aspiration is to see them succeed, and then actually to see them rebound back onto traditional nation states in such a way as to force traditional nation states to sort of change themselves in a more libertarian vein. More deregulation, more privatization, and the like. The premise behind this is that, if you have a successful, if seasteading becomes a kind of successful project to the degree that it can scale up and begin to attract lots of people, and so people begin to abandon the traditional nation state and so forth, that nation states will have to become like companies and compete for citizens as if citizens were clients. And then in the process of doing that, they would change their constitutional structures and so on and so forth. And it sounds far-fetched, but I think there's a real sense in which this can be achieved and that you can actually bend reality to your will. I mean, I call it a rebound effect because I purposely wanted to draw from Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism, in which he calls European fascism, the rebound effect of colonialism. And it's a polemical point, but it's one that I wanted to make because there is something about this that's deeply, profoundly disturbing ideologically. It's not just about exit, right? It's about exit with then a project to not leave the rest of us alone. And in some sense to negatively impact not just the state, but the variety of ways in which people might find forms of community and want to live. I try to be very careful to ensure that the reader not mistake things like Zapatista autonomous territories in southern Mexico or territories in resistance that Raul Zabecki writes about in Argentina and elsewhere. Those are not exit communities. Those are not what I'm talking about. I like the language of Andrei Grubacek and Dennis O'Hairn, seeing them as exilic communities that have a certain kind of tension, but understandable tension relationship with the state. And that's not who I'm talking about here when I talk about exit communities.
Well, the question of the state is an interesting one in all this, because obviously Michael Oliver and contemporary libertarians set themselves up against the state. And yet, of course, in some of these instances, it's actually the state that facilitates their project. Post-coup Honduras being this important example. And I think it speaks to the danger of sort of taking these people at their word and understanding the state through their lens and missing the fact that free markets are not about the disappearance of the state from the scene. In fact, the state is absolutely essential for the functioning of free markets. Can you talk about that, the sort of the language of extreme hostility to the state and then the reality?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, I come back to this in the conclusion and I try to point it out along the way. I mean, I want to point it out, I like the way you phrased it. I mean, it shouldn't be seen as a contradiction, I guess, or it shouldn't easily be dismissed as hypocrisy. I think the way to think about this is to rethink the state in some sense. And of course, they have absolutely there's no way in which they can simply operate without some kind of relationship with the state. And Michael Oliver was very clear about this. He's like, I don't necessarily want to see, the United States or any other state sort of just disappear, but in the meantime, we got to try something better, right? But yeah, the Honduras case is a very clear one. You have the sort of Silicon Valley libertarian crowd and people who were closely connected to Ronald Reagan's administration, talk about the state, who are allied with an illegal coup regime that ruled from 2009 until November of this past year, November of 2021. So they're, it's kind of the double whammy. They're doing business, and they're doing business with an illegal state. The Seasteading Institute in 2015 hosted an event in San Francisco called Disrupting Democracy, which I think they thought sounded sexy and cool. And they invited the illegal head of the coup regime in Honduras to come speak, Juan Orlando Hernandez. I mean, it's pretty awful. Particularly when you consider, how violent the past decade has been in Honduras under that regime. So yeah, I mean, the other point I would make here is that the state itself is becoming a kind of new place for economic capture. I mean, it's not just about making the state disappear. I think there's also a component here where the state will continue to exist, but it becomes a place of kind of conservative libertarian capture. Privatization of the military. I mean, anybody who lives in outside of Washington, D.C. has seen this over the past 20 years, the rise of privatized military services. And so so much of Fairfax County, Virginia, is essentially, right, the privatized military universe, right, surveillance operations and intelligence services and so on and so forth. There's a kind of revolving door, right, between military and private industry. Private contractors outnumbered military personnel in Iraq at various points in time, and so forth. You can see this on so many different levels. Sam Adler-Bell had a piece in the New York Times recently where I think he very astutely points out the ways in which Blake Masters, who co-wrote a book with Peter Thiel, celebrating sort of monopoly, right? That the free market is inefficient, and in fact, monopoly is actually the way to go. Blake Masters is running as a kind of MAGA Trumpist in Arizona for political office, and Masters is sort of, this is not a kind of libertarian project in the sort of naive sense of no government, but in fact the opposite. It's a kind of capture of the state in a certain kind of way. And so yeah, I think it's absolutely right that none of us should fall prey to or victim to the sort of naive idea that this is somehow or another the state withers away and is no longer going to exist under libertarian rule. The last thing I'll say about this very quickly is, the sort of neo-reactionary, neo-feudalism movement that's associated with some of this stuff, coming out of Silicon Valley in particular, Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, some of the other theorists, they're very explicit about this. So there's a German American anarcho-capitalist named Hans Hermann Hoppe, and Hoppe's position vis-a-vis this stuff is fairly straightforward, which is, while we can't make an exit state right now, in the meantime, we can do something else, which is we can decide if we want democracy or monarchy. And he, of course, falls on the side of monarchy. And his basic position is one where he takes basically the premises of Garrett Hardin, right, that the commons is going to be overexploited and so on and so forth, and suggests that governing is a kind of commons, and that if you have a democratic system, you have these people who sort of rotate in and out of office and have no vested interest in the well-being of the population, whereas a monarch is interested in the well-being of their population because they're dependent upon them in some kind of fashion. And so it's, it's the sort of tragedy of the commoners, right? I mean, it's a kind of, he takes this argument of Hardin and applies it to political theory for pretty nefarious ends, which is to argue for the return of monarchy and a certain kind of feudalism. Yeah.
To what do you attribute the high rate of failure of these efforts? Because the story of Michael Oliver is a rather amazing one on some level, since he was, absolutely resolute that he was going to try and achieve this. It was incredibly persistent in the face of multiple failures. But even when we see contemporary versions of this, the rate of failure is very high. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's simply the hubris of people who sort of see a blank slate onto which they can sort of plop their project? Or do you think there are additionally other forces at work that are likely to lead to failure?
Yeah, I think I would give a spectrum of things here, going from hubris to thinking about local resistance in politics, as well as accommodation, to a kind of, let's say, more institutional resistance or inertia at the kind of international sort of legal level. So in terms of hubris, yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of hubristic aspect to this, which sets it up for failure at some level. I mean, I don't want to misrepresent the views of many of the individuals I'm talking about, even though I'm not a fan. The seasteaders are very clear. Patrick Friedman, amongst others, they've been clear that they understand that many of these things are kind of pipe dreams. But their position in part is that why not explore these kinds of things, and why not at least sort of make a kind of effort. And so, I don't think they're delusional. I think they're experimental, and I just think the nature of their experiments, are problematic. Some of these are, just collapse in absolutely spectacular fashion. They're like the sort of, new country version of the Fire Festival, that famous festival where you were going to get, this giant, fancy, elegant tent with a stuffed tiger and gourmet meals, and you ended up, in a sort of cut-rate Patagonia tent with a sort of grilled cheese sandwich that was soggy. That guy just got out of prison, by the way. 5 years, he just got out. We'll see what comes next. But so there's a kind of delusional component there. There's a hubristic component. But I think that there's also, it's very important to pay attention to the responses of people in the locales where these things are tested out. Because they're not, we know they're not blank slates. And as much as the individuals who want to undertake these might mistakenly think that these are blank slates, or might mistakenly think that people in these places are going to welcome them with open arms or something like this, that of course is not the case. Whether we're talking about Honduras, whether we're talking about Tonga, whether we're talking about Vanuatu, there is populations there, and these are populations who, some of them will ally themselves with Michael Oliver, but they'll ally themselves with Michael Oliver not because they're dupes or naive, but because they want to achieve their own ends in a certain way. They want to reestablish a certain kind of balance of power, for example, between themselves and other anti-colonial movements in the archipelago. And so that complicates these projects in many respects. In the case of Tahiti, with the seasteaders, the memorandum of understanding that they signed died after a year because resistance was quite fierce by local populations and representatives on the island of Tahiti, who did not want an anchored, fixed, billionaire platform in a lagoon off the coast. So I think there's that issue, which is quite important. And I do want to stress there's a lot of resistance to these, but there's also populations that do ally themselves. Michael Oliver, to this day, and I mean, he's still alive. He's 94. But when I was in Vanuatu, many of the people I spoke, reviled his name, but many people I spoke to revered his name, but they all remembered him, but there were a lot of people who thought he was, quite an impressive figure. And there were, rumors about whether or not he'd returned at the age of 87 in 2015 and things like this. And then the last thing I would say is I think the other aspect of failure here, at least in the sort of immediate sense of failure, right, that the immediate realization of these things doesn't come through, is the kind of broader political legal structure that works strongly against the success of these things. Right, there's a kind of inertia, there's a kind of system in place that makes it enormously difficult for things like this to succeed. Even sort of humorous, halfway serious micronations that someone creates, where they create a little flag and their own currency and so forth, just for fun and things like this. Very hard for any of those kinds of things to get legal standing, to get international recognition. They can issue passports and so forth, but it doesn't necessarily mean much. And when they do have some kind of purchase to them, it usually ends up bleeding over very quickly into a kind of murky underworld that's not very pleasant. This is what happened to Sealand, the platform owned by the Bates family in the North Sea. So I think there's that also. There is a kind of large overarching structure that is not timeless, right? I mean, the nation state is a pretty recent creation, and the idea of territorial sovereignty is a pretty recent creation, but it's fairly powerful right now. Yeah.
Let me ask a question, and then I think we should open things up. But the goings on of libertarian exiteers today is frequently fodder in the press because written in ways about sort of these zany characters who do stupid things, and aren't they laughable? And there might be also a bit of a critique in there, but basically these people are sort of portrayed as buffoons. And while one could see the appeal of such an approach, does it concern you in the sense that it kind of fits into a larger tendency of those within the left and within liberalism too, to not take the ideas of the right particularly seriously, and it could be argued at its peril?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think you do a disservice to critical thinking and to historical thought when you don't take people seriously, especially when they take themselves seriously. And so I think it's important to take these projects seriously. By saying that, I don't mean to say that we, somehow or another take them at their word, or that even we necessarily meet them halfway. There are some ideas that are just, you shouldn't meet halfway at all. So I don't think, I'm not suggesting we don't subject them to critique, but I think to subject them to critique and to understand the implications, both where these come from and where they might go, you have to understand them in a sort of grounded, serious way. And at some level, by taking them seriously, I think we also get hints of why it is that there's a kind of gravitational pull among some towards these projects, and we also get a sense of the sort of, what's the best way to put this, the less developed or the less spectacular versions of these projects that are in some sense going forward. I mean, I think by taking these projects seriously, it sheds new offers a kind of way of seeing with a different kind of clarity some of the things that are already around us, and that might actually kind of already look like this, but we didn't actually look at it like that and think about it in this way. And so, yeah, the sort of yuck jokey side of it, that's an easy response, and it's fine. I mean, the Love, Death, and Robots season 3, the first episode called Exit Strategies, it's quite funny, and I really like it, and I howled with laughter the first time I saw it. But it's a Netflix cartoon, right? It's an animated special. It's not a serious piece of kind of critical engagement in writing.
Okay, so I think Ash is now going to bring in questions from the audience. Thank you, Ray.
Sure, yeah, thanks so much for the conversation. For folks who are here in the audience, we can take some time to answer any questions you might have. So you can use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. There is one question submitted already. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe Trey, if you're still here in the audience, if you want to clarify your question more so. But Trey did ask, I guess, there's been a lot of references to some of these projects, either the seasteads or in Honduras, Acapulco. And Trey is sort of wondering, are there any sort of examples of these capitalist utopias in the north, in the global north?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yes, so I think probably the most well-known example that comes to mind, at least in the US, is the Free State Project in New Hampshire. And the operating premise had been, from a while back, to get, I think, 20,000 people by 2020 to relocate to New Hampshire, and at least in part to populate municipal councils and things like this, and sort of, gut them from within. There's been a couple of interesting things that have happened. I mean, this was the thing, by the way, the Free Enterprise Foundation, the Koch brothers, the Reason Foundation associated with the Cato Institute, they funded some of this stuff. There was a kind of backcountry Burning Man in New Hampshire called the Porcupine Fest, which was part of this. And when it first started, people only bought things with pieces of, silver or metal or things like this. It was an effort to kind of, experiment with this kind of stuff. And so there's been some interesting writing about this. And the two things most famously, there was a book recently that came out. I can't remember the author's last name, but it's called When a Libertarian Walks into a Bear. And it's the story of what happens in one of the towns in New Hampshire when essentially trash collection services were taken away. There's no longer trash collection because there was an effort to basically sort of, gut municipal services. And so the trash accumulated. So the bears basically invaded the town and started just coming in and hanging out to eat the trash. And of course, this was dangerous and not pleasant for people, but it raised all of these problems about them, what to do about the social services and trash collection and so forth. And the other example of this is the, I don't remember the name of the town, but the city council and an effort to strip the public school system of funding, which passed because of a kind of lack of awareness by a lot of the populace. And so there was a kind of gutting of the school system, at which point then a whole array of people in the town had to kind of mobilize lots of people to sign a petition to get a referendum to kind of return money to the public school system. So these are certain kinds of examples. I think that New Hampshire is a place where some of these kinds of things have taken place. There was the governor of Nevada, who's a Democrat, by the way. This isn't just a Republican thing. I haven't talked about the sort of conservative Republican component to this. I mean, I could at a future point, because the interesting thing is these very socially conservative Republicans are in strange ways, but maybe not strange ways, kind of linked up with a lot of this stuff too. It's where kind of, property rights ends up bringing strange bedfellows together in somewhat nefarious ways. But, the Democratic governor of Nevada has proposed innovation zones. And these are not, it's not a charter city, and it's not exactly a sort of version of what I'm suggesting here. But I mean, it might be more like a company town, but it still has some of the trappings, some of the language, some of the inklings of this. And the idea behind an innovation zone is that there's some, again, empty land, in theory, in Nevada. And if you have more than 78 acres and you're a tech company, you must be a tech company. So you've got to be involved in blockchain, AI, and things like this. The idea behind this is that you would be able to take that 78 acres or larger and basically sort of run it entirely along your own lines, right? In some ways. And so you would become a kind of private independent county in some respect. It's not clear, the sort of details of it haven't been hashed out, and I'm not sure if it's going forward. I haven't seen much about it since about 2019 or so. So yes, there are things like this. And of course, the earlier hints of this come from places that contract out for municipal services, right? Kind of gated communities and communities that are usually tend to be fairly well-to-do, and instead of having and paying for with taxpayer money and property taxes for their own municipal services, they contract out for these services. Sort of, it's basically they privatize out to it, and it's a kind of economy of scale in which they're able to save money at the expense of the public, frankly. Mike Davis writes about this in City of Quartz for the case of Lakewood and other places, other subdivisions in Los Angeles. You can see this in parts of Georgia as well. And so there's varieties of these things at various scales. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, that's great. We don't currently have any more questions, and we do have some time. Sasha, did you have any more questions?
Yeah, well, Ray, I wanted to ask you about the degree to which contemporary versions of exit libertarianism are fueled by fear of climate change. I'm thinking of the seasteads, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? Lifts all, I don't know, floating rigs. But also a more generalized anxiety about social disorder that might come out of climate disruption or anything else. So it's not just sort of escaping the strictures of the state, so-called, but also the rabble. Obviously, you do need some rabble if you can have servants or whatever it is, but most of the rabble needs to stay far away.
Yes, I think, and that's a kind of continuity between the projects of the 1960s and the contemporary projects, I think, to some degree, which is a sort of fear of the masses, essentially. Even the climate change aspect is interesting because the seasteaders, they're very strategic. They market the project in interesting ways. They suggest that, for example, seasteads could allow Oceanians, right, Pacific Islanders, to not become climate refugees, that they would be able to stay in their homelands because the seasteads would, in some form or another, substitute for the land that's going underwater by having the seastead remain there. It's not clear to me how realistic that is in terms of size, affordability, and so forth. But it's also completely unclear, and I haven't found any answers to this in the literature that they offer. When you have let's say you are able to create an enormous seastead that would house, upwards of 10,000 people or something like this, what does that seastead become? I mean, does it become, Kiribati? Does it become Tahiti? Is it leased by the government in exile now of Tahiti? Is it offered up, by generous libertarian utopians to Pacific Islanders? I mean, it's not entirely clear what happens and what the kind of legal status of these places are. So there's a kind of, there's a sales pitch about climate change and a sort of, sustainability. I mean, all the classic buzzwords of the sort of, green economy, green capitalist economy. It's always, right, it's always save the world and make a lot of money doing it. And so, which should raise a lot of suspicion. And so the climate change aspect of this, I think, has made for a good sales pitch. But I think, one needs to be very, very dubious of that. And more broadly, the one thing I'll just say on this as well is that what's frustrating and problematic and very obvious as well is that in many cases, the argument about a sort of socially progressive, right? That the drug laws are crazy, right? And I think we can all agree that the drug laws are ridiculous. And amongst many other things, I mean, you can think about now the post-Dobbs decision, right? And so there's, and there have been, right, projects to be able to provide abortion outside of, right, the political zone, the 12-mile political zone. And so there's an array of different kinds of projects here. But for the libertarian exiters I looked at, they're concerned about things like drug laws and the like, but they're not the ones who are going to be persecuted or have been persecuted since the 1970s under those kinds of draconian drug laws. And the people who have been most intensely victimized and persecuted by Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan and the drug laws in the United States and so forth are people who are in the least possibility of exiting. And in fact, the state has already exited from them. They have no schools, they have no parks, they have no social housing, they have police and more prisons. And so in some sense, like the aspects of the state, have already left them and left them only with the most repressive components of it. And so there's this kind of misdirection in the way these projects often get sold that I think, we have to kind of not get distracted by.
Go ahead.
Any other questions, Ash?
We haven't had any other questions come in.
Okay, then I will jump in.
Okay.
Ray, how does the highly sort of techno-focused approach of libertarians today, how does that differ from the impulses of the Michael Olivers and of the past? I mean, one of the things that you note is certainly around Michael Oliver, he attracted a very motley crew. I mean, the story itself is, you mentioned James Bond before, and it definitely reads like Ian Fleming. So many of the sort of the cast of characters around Michael Oliver, from British lords to soldiers of fortune, real estate people from, I think it was Hawaii. Anyway, from all sorts of strange characters appear. But you note that there was a particular attraction at that time of those in the military, and I think for the reasons that you illustrated when you were talking about the privatization of that part of the state more recently. Has that kind of shifted as the way that contemporary libertarianism dresses itself up in this highly sort of techno-focused, technological, edgy approach, or is there more continuity than discontinuity?
Yeah, that's a good question about the continuity, discontinuity. It's hard, at least looking at the projects of Oliver, despite the kind of engineering challenges and the architectural challenges and so forth, but there's not a lot of what you would call kind of tech futuristic aspects to his work. To the degree that, some of the other individuals at the same time, so one of the individuals I talk about, Werner Stiefel. So Stiefel had a similar history. He was from Germany, and he and his family had to flee Nazi Germany. He became a pharmaceutical engineer in upstate New York and attempted to build a ship to sail to the Caribbean, where he and his followers, he called them immigrants, they were renters who lived in the hotel they owned off of I-87, would set up what he called an Atlantis there. And, someone like Stiefel was reading Buckminster Fuller, was reading a lot of the sort of futurists of the 1960s. You can think also of Future Shock by Alvin Toffler and a lot of the sci-fi writing of the time. This is an era in which people are talking about orbital space colonization. Not so much Mars, but orbital space colonization, space stations, and the like. And so you do have this kind of futuristic moment. Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Catalog, this this mix of sort of hippie and yuppie that Fred Turner in his book From Counterculture to Cyberculture talks about in really wonderful detail. So you have that, but Oliver and a lot of his followers were not. This was not their thing. They were much more sort of hands in the dirt, just finding the territory and actually beginning to just sort of build. Their concern was really about how you structure investment. Do people have to settle there? Can they be investors through speculation? How do you set up a corporation to handle investment and so on and so forth? And a lot of his concern was really about controlling who participated. So even though it's supposed to be a kind of libertarian opt-in kind of society, Oliver actually issued an article in one of his newsletters in which he said, there's been some misunderstandings. So let me clarify, we will not allow communists, nihilists, or anarchists, right? Because there was, he was getting letters of interest from people who he felt were confused about what the project looked like. So already there was, sort of these kinds of restrictions, but it wasn't that kind of futuristic tech stuff. I think the current tech stuff, again, is I don't want to say it's a distraction, but it's in some sense, it's a kind of window dressing at some level. And this is not to say that aspects of the kind of tech utopian world of Silicon Valley isn't there and sort of feeding into a lot of this in various ways, but some of it is kind of window dressing for what are very basic acts of dispossession of, I put it at some point that, this is more J.W. Marriott than Thomas More. It's timeshare sovereignty in the end at some level. And I'm not trying to dismiss it, but, the person I always go back to here to kind of go directly to your question is, J.G. Ballard. And you could also think of Octavia Butler in this respect as well, which is, Ballard was pretty straightforward that, even in the 1960s, he basically said, the future is going to be boring and it's going to be a sort of, hyper version of what we already have, tedious, exploitative, grim. He was a bit of a pessimist, having grown up in a concentration camp in Shanghai. And so, but his point was that all of his later sci-fi are essentially isolated private compounds of the wealthy in which they're bored and they're boring, and they import crime for erogenous stimulation, and they go out and basically savage the local communities for entertainment. And one of the points I wanted to make is that it sounds far-fetched, but in its specifics, but in its general sense, he's absolutely right that we're going to pay the price for this kind of elite agency, right? That's the future. Much less so, I think, the sort of whatever tech, hoopla surrounds it. It's still a basic process of accumulation by dispossession and class exploitation and warfare.
I have a question about dispossession, and maybe this should be our last, Ash, which is around the notion of colonization. Obviously, Michael Oliver, when he was trying to set up his projects, it was during a time of decolonization, which in many ways feels kind of remote now. But this notion that the ocean is something that is just sort of ripe for the taking, that it's open and we can just colonize it in the same way space is also framed the same way, something to be colonized, seems to live on. And I wondered if you could talk about where that idea comes from, and why we have, that why this notion is still with us, following decolonization and all these struggles.
Yeah. Yeah, the Minerva Reef case, the case in the first, sort of substantive chapter in which I talk about Oliver. I mean, one of the things that brought me to this project in part was exactly this question. Having, my wife is she grew up in Hawaii and she's a outrigger canoeer, and knowing a little bit about outrigger canoeing and thinking about the history of it, I mean, it's clear from the perspective of Oceanians, right, that the ocean is not some kind of open, vast barrier. It's a liquid plain. It's a connector, right? It's part and parcel of one's existence, right? It's not just terrestrial. You're oceanic at some level. So that in and of itself is problematic. This assumption about the ocean, and the seasteaders are very savvy about this. I mean, one of the promotional items for the seasteaders called Tahitians, the first seasteaders. The Polynesians were the first seasteaders, and they were trying to reference right, this open ocean navigation tradition of Oceanian peoples, but in a way that was strategically right supportive of seasteading, which I found very problematic. It was kind of reworking the past in a very particular kind of way. But the longstanding, claim about the ocean has always been that it's a commons. But what that means is not entirely clear. And I mean, one of the issues that gets slowly worked out over the course of the 20th century is whether or not you can have a floating sovereign entity. What happens if it's an artificial fixed entity or not? What's its legal status? So on the one hand, you can't essentially lay claim, but on the other hand, you can't necessarily prevent people from establishing something that might be floating, for example. And so there's a lot of ambiguity in this, and the UN Commission on the Laws of the Sea over the course of, especially starting after World War II and up until the 1980s, there was a series of commissions by the United Nations that were designed to basically try to figure these things out and to have international agreements. Some of these international agreements have become problematic over the past few months because there's been questions about mining of the seabed, mining lithium for iPhone batteries and this kind of stuff, and it's become quite complicated. But in the 70s, a lot of this had not entirely been worked out, and so for Oliver, and for his supporters, there was a sense in which the ambiguities around the legal status of the high seas and the ocean were an opportunity. But that very same ambiguity was something that could be mobilized by those resisting right, these kinds of colonization efforts and so forth. But you're right, it's ongoing. I mean, the legal status of the so-called high seas has been an issue for the seasteaders. They haven't been able to kind of nail this down at some level. And of course, now you have exclusive economic zones that expand way out from the shores, right? It used to be 12-mile political zone, and now you've got a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, which expands, substantially onto these spaces and what can exist there and not exist there, and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Well, clearly, this is probably a conversation that could go on for much longer. There's lots of information here, but unfortunately, we're reaching our time for tonight.
Yes.
But yeah, thank you so much, Ray, and thank you, Sasha, for taking the time to share with us tonight, and for the questions you brought, Sasha, and for just the vast amount of information that's in here, Ray. I dropped a link in the chat for folks if you've not picked up a copy of the book yet. Tonight was a very thorough discussion of some of its content, but there's a lot more in the book. It's a great way to support Ray and support Firestorm, so please do pick up a copy if you haven't yet. And yeah, everybody who registered for this event, you'll get a follow-up email with a link to the recording. So there's lots of information here. You'll be able to view the conversation again. So yeah, thanks so much for doing this, y'all, and we hope to see you again in the future.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Alrighty, have a good night now.
Good night.
Goodbye.